I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Lott.
Thank you, Professor. Good morning.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate Chairman Hansen and Representative Fiora inviting me. My name is John Lott. I've been a professor most of my life, having had positions at the Wharton Business School, University of Chicago, Yale, Stanford, Rice. But right now I'm speaking to you as president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. There are three general issues that I'd like to briefly address. One is the general behavior of permit holders. Two is concerns about risks that might arise from permit holders being present at mass public shootings. And three are the possible benefits from allowing people to go and carry in what had previously been gun-free zones.
Professor, let me interrupt you for 1 second. You are the author of this, correct?
Correct. More Guns, Less Crime, from the University of Chicago Press.
Very good. So you are actually from Illinois?
Well, I lived in Illinois when I was at the University of Chicago, but right now I'm from around the Philly area.
Very good. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. Thank you.
Please continue.
Anyway, with regard to the behavior of permit holders, if you look at the data for 2014, you had a revocation rate for permit holders of a little bit over 1/10 of 1 percentage point. If you look at anything that's related to either felony convictions or anything that might be related to violence, it's in about a little bit in the thousandths of 1 percentage point. But it's not even clear from the data that I was able to get from the legislative analysts whether any of those cases involve firearms. So that may be even an overestimate of the risk for people who have firearms permits. The experience is similar in other states. If you look at the states that we have information on firearms violations that result in revocations, it's usually in the tens of thousands of 1 percentage point, or at most thousands of 1 percentage point. And most of those are for relatively trivial cases. We have a lot of experience with regard to the gun-free zones that are being talked about in this legislation. With regard to colleges, for example, 11 states mandate that if someone has a concealed handgun permit, that public universities and colleges be mandated to allow them to carry in at least some form on college campuses. There are another 21 states that leave it up to the individual university to decide. With regard to K through 12, according to the National Council for State Legislatures, over 20 states in some form allow permit holders to carry permanent concealed handguns on school property. And prior to the early 1990s, when the Federal Safe School Zone Act was passed, basically any of the states that allowed concealed carry on school property. We can look at a variety of behavior, but if you look at crimes, for example, by permit holders on any type of school property, I've not been able to find, nor anybody's been able to point to, an example of a crime that's been committed in a place where they're allowed to carry by permit holders. And I've been able to find 3 accidents that have occurred over time in either university or K through 12 property. All 3 of those accidents were non-trivial. Were trivial in terms of any harm that was done. Just to give you an idea of how law-abiding permit holders are, we recently did an analysis that looked at crime rates by police officers and comparing them to permit holders. I have a handout that's included there. And what you find is the police officers are incredibly law-abiding. The rate at which they go and are convicted of any type of felony or misdemeanor is less than 1/30th the rate of the general population. But if you compare it to permit holders are very law-abiding compared to police officers. At most, their conviction rates are about 1/6 the rate of police officers. We can also look at the behavior of college-age permit holders. There's a lot of concern about that, a lot of hypothetical things that might go wrong. Rather than guessing about this, there's several states that I have data for. I have a report that I presented to you for Michigan and Texas where we had data broken down by year of age. And what you find is that permit holders who are of college age, either 18 to 22 in the case of Texas or 21 to 22 in the case of Michigan, are at least or much more law-abiding than the general population, in fact. So it's not just a question of how young people behave, but the question is how do permit holders behave. Now, with regard to the second general issue, concerns about the risks in places like mass public shootings, there are a lot of hypotheticals that are raised. Primarily, examples would be what happens if a permit holder accidentally shoots a bystander when they're trying to stop one of these mass public shootings. You can go through every single one of the cases where a permit holder has stopped a mass public shooting. There's not one single case where a permit holder has accidentally shot a bystander. So is this possible that something like that might occur? Yes. But at least it seems like you should be able to point to at least one incident where something like that has actually taken place. With regard to the concerns that police, when they arrive on the scene, might accidentally shoot a permit holder, is that a possibility? Sure. But when you in fact look at the actual behavior of police officers, you find there's not one single case where a permit holder has stopped one of these mass public shootings where police officers have gotten confused and accidentally shot the permit holder by mistake. There are other issues that I could possibly go through, but those are the two main ones that usually seem to be raised in these cases. The third general area is one of the benefits from allowing permit holders. Probably the most striking piece of evidence to me is that if you look since 1950, with just two exceptions, every single one of the mass public shootings where 4 or more people have been killed have taken place where general population is not allowed to carry handguns. It's just not in the United States. In Europe, all the mass public shootings have taken place where people aren't allowed to defend themselves in that way. And these cases are just not random. You know, in Nevada, if you have a concealed handgun permit, you're allowed to carry your permit concealed handgun virtually any place in the state. If these types of attacks were random, you'd think that 98 or 99% of the attacks would be taking place where permanent concealed handguns are allowed, rather than in the tiny areas within the state, either here or in other states, where permanent concealed handguns are banned. The thing that's interesting for anybody who actually goes through and reads the documents in these mass public shootings is how these attackers consciously pick out those areas where they know victims aren't able to go and defend themselves. I'll just give you a couple cases from this past year, for example. You probably read or know about the Santa Barbara shooting last June, in which 6 people in total were killed. Well, if you actually read the 141-page manifesto from the killer in that case, after you get by him complaining about women not appreciating what a great guy he is about 50 times, what you find is that he goes through excruciating detail explaining why he picked the particular venue to go and engage in his attack. There are multiple cases like this. I'll just give you one example. He mentions in the manifesto how the ideal target he would think would be spring break in Santa Barbara, which is where he was. Apparently, spring break is, and Santa Barbara is the mecca for students from around California, indeed much of the West, to go there to celebrate spring break. And he said that it'd be a target-rich, to use his term, target-rich environment for him in terms of trying to kill the college-age students that he wanted to kill. But he did extensive research, as they frequently do in these cases, and what he said was, for example, he looked at old YouTube videos or read news reports, and he said there were just too many armed police officers in the area, and that maybe he could go and kill 1 or 2 of the police officers, but since there were so many police officers there who would be armed, he was sure he would be killed before he could go and start killing the students, which were his primary target. And so he then went on to other targets that possible targets that he discussed. Just a couple weeks after that, in Moncton, New Brunswick, Canada, there was another mass public shooting. On the killer's Facebook page, he had literally a dozen comics about gun-free zones and making fun about gun-free zones. On one of the comics that he had a mass public shooter. He had a victim who was trying to stumble and run away from the mass public shooter, and the victim was turning to the killer saying, "You can't have a gun here. We banned guns in these places. You can't shoot me." And above the killer's head, he has a little bubble saying, "What a moron," as he's aiming the gun at the person who's trying to run away. All I'm trying to make clear here is that this person was obviously aware of gun-free zones and was considering them in, or would have thought about them in connection with his attack. Those are just from this last year. There are many other similar cases over time that one could go and point to. You look at something like the Batman movie theater shooting. There were 7 movie theaters within a 20-minute drive of the killer's apartment. Only one of the movie theaters actually posted signs banning permitted concealed handguns. The killer didn't go to the movie theater that was closest to his home. He didn't go to the movie theater that posted that it had the largest auditoriums in the state of Colorado, which you would think would be attractive for somebody who wanted to kill as many people as possible on a premiere of a Batman movie. Instead, he went to the only movie theater that posted signs banning permitted concealed handguns. You can go to our website. We have a long list of mall shootings, and what you find is that in every single one of the mass public shootings involving malls, they all were posted areas where people weren't allowed to go and carry permitted concealed handguns. Even though there would be many other malls in the area, often closer to the killer's home, that were not posted, they would continually pick the areas that were posted. Now, I'll just leave you with one general thought. Ron Noble, who's the head of Interpol, kind of Europe's version of the FBI, a little bit broader than that, after the Westland Mall killing in Nairobi, Kenya in 2013, came out with a statement. He basically said there were like 68 people that were killed in that mall shooting, 157 people who were wounded. The reason why I bring this up in part is just 2 weeks ago, the Somali terrorist group who was involved in that Kenya shooting made a threat against Mall of America, which actually also happens to be a gun-free zone, the largest mall in the United States, Minnesota. But if you look at Ron Noble's statement, he basically said there's 2 ways to stop these types of attacks. You can either make an area a gun-free zone, or you can allow victims to be able to go and defend themselves. And he said his views have changed dramatically over time. When he first became head of Interpol, he thought the obvious solution was just to ban guns from certain areas. But what he had learned over time is that it's basically impossible to actually effectively ban guns from areas, that particularly when you're dealing with terrorist groups or other people who are planning these attacks. And these mass public shooters that we have in the United States, you take something like Adam Lanza. He was planning it for 2.5 years. Other criminals, a year. Short periods of time, there are 6 months that they're planning these attacks. But when they're planning these attacks for long periods of times in advance, he said it's basically impossible to prevent them from bringing weapons into the area. And so what he said was the only people you're really disarming are the victims in this case, and not the people who are perpetrating the attacks. And so he said himself and others who he's talked to have changed their opinion about what might be the best way of going and trying to stop these attacks. What might seem the most obvious way of solving it to begin with actually makes it safer for the criminals to go and do the attack and make it more likely they'll be successful. In my work with Bill Landis at the University of Chicago, when we did research on this, we basically found that the one thing that determines how many people get killed or injured in these attacks is the amount of time that elapses between the attack starts and when someone is able to arrive on the scene with a gun to stop it. And I thank you very much for your time.
Professor, thank you. Sheriff Allen?